Sanja Kulenovic is a Russian-born Bosnian, now an American citizen, who has called Southern California home since the early 1990s, when she was stranded in this country due to the Bosnian War. She studied economics and English language and literature at the University of Sarajevo before coming here. In 1993, she presented a speech at a United Nations sponsored event for Bosnian women and children. Since then, Sanja has earned a master's degree in economics and has been working as a financial analyst for an engineer corporation that helped rebuild Bosnia's infrastructure after the war. She resides in Los Angeles with her husband and two daughters. Today, she is going to talk about the Siege of Sarajevo, the book she initially wrote for her children and then decided to share with the world. Her book illustrates the human toll of war and the personal consequences that are often dismissed as faraway conflicts. We couldn't have a more timely speaker today than someone who knows firsthand from family and friends what it's like to be under siege, just as the Ukraine is today. Sanja, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I always treasure the opportunity to talk about the siege of Sarajevo, talk about my hometown, my people. So very happy to be here today. Thank you. So I will begin just with few more words about myself. Obviously, first generation immigrant. I first came to this country back in 1983 when I was a high school student, and I spent a year in Pasadena living with an American family. After that, I went back to my home country, which was then called Yugoslavia. I graduated from the university there. And then when I got married, my husband and I came to Pasadena to our honeymoon and to visit my host family. But shortly after we arrived, the war broke out and we could not return. So we became instant refugees. Ever since then, we've been living in the Pasadena area. I've been working for the same company for more than 25 years. Not a writer by profession, actually far from it. So to have my book published and to be in a company of people who are interested in hearing my story is really an honor for me. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about my book, how and why I wrote it, but more importantly, I will talk about Sarajevo, excuse me, its history and its people, how they survived almost 4 years of siege, and how their story relates to us today, what we can perhaps learn from it, whether we think of us, being under siege during this pandemic, or just thinking about these unfortunate events in Ukraine. So how did I even think about writing a book and not even in my own language? It all started years after the siege ended, when I found a stack of letters that I had received from my family and friends during the war. So I started rereading those letters. My daughters were in elementary school at that time, and they really didn't know much about what was happening in the Balkans in the 90s, except that grandmas and grandpas were in the war. So I decided to read them a few letters from my father, who wrote very long, very descriptive letters of life in the siege. For example, he would elaborate how he carried water or how he constructed a reading lamp out of a cup of oil and a shoelace. And the more I read to them, the more questions I was getting. well, Mom, why was Grandpa in the war in the first place? What did he do wrong? Why were we born here? Did that really happen in real life? And so that's when I decided, well, I really have a job to do here. I have to teach my children what had happened in Sarajevo at that time. And I couldn't think of a better way to do it than actually through the words of those people who survived it all. So I embarked on this project of collecting all these letters. I sorted them by years. I translated them into English. I added to them some articles that I had saved from years ago from the siege. And then I also added to it bits and pieces of my own immigrant life in America, my own beginnings, because my husband and I did not have any status here. We did not have work permits. We basically came here on tourist visas and, one suitcase. So there was a lot of things, happening at that time, and being a refugee from, a place where we led a privileged life, and, all of a sudden being stateless and almost homeless was really something to, go through. So little by little, this story came together, and it turned out it wasn't just a family project for my children. By using these letters actually became a vehicle to tell the story of Sarajevo, and the voices of Sarajevan people who laid out their experiences and their emotions right then and there made this story, I think, very unique, very authentic, and also, I would like to think, very valuable from a historical perspective. So is this a book that talks about conflict that happened a long time ago in a faraway land? Yes. Does it talk about suffering and human degradation? Absolutely. But I would like to think that that is just a framework in which another picture is painted, and that this book is actually about life created under those circumstances. It's a very universal story of people's resilience, and not just that in spite of attitude that we associate with this term. It's much more than that. It's a completely different mindset. And I think you will see that once I start going through my presentation. So some of you might be familiar with Sarajevo, maybe from history books, since World War I started there in 1914 with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Or if you're a sports fan, maybe you remember that Sarajevo hosted Winter Olympic Games in 1984. But most likely, if you are familiar with Sarajevo, you remember the infamous Sarajevo siege of the 1990s, as it was on primetime news all over the world for years. And it's actually incredible to think that this could happen to a capital city at the end of the 20th century in the middle of Europe. And it's not just any capital city. It's a city that has always been known for its tolerance. Actually, Sarajevo was nicknamed a little Jerusalem of Europe. So here I would like to start my presentation, because I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the history of the city. So I'm going to go and share my screen here. So this is, so now you can see it's fine, right?
Yes, we can see it fine.
Yeah. So the city of Sarajevo was founded back in the 15th century during the Ottoman rule in the Balkans. And its first citizens were Slavs who converted to Islam with the Ottomans, and then Catholics and Christian Orthodox. And then in 1492, when Jews were expelled from Spain, they also came to Sarajevo. So from the very early times, the population of Sarajevo has been very varied in terms of religion and ethnic backgrounds. And from the very beginning, people have learned to live together. These religion institutions that were very important back at that time, and the residential areas that were constructed around them, given the size of the city, were built very close to one another. So that also gave people the chance to, oh, there's a message there.
Oh, I just turned on the closed caption.
Oh, okay.
Somebody requested
Okay.
that. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, no problem. So what I was going to say is that from the very beginning, people of Sarajevo learned to tolerate other religions. Everyone got along together very well. And that's how it's been through the generations as governments changed from the Ottoman rule for almost 400 years, then through the Habsburgs, and then through the German occupation during the Second World War. Here on the left, you can see a mosque that dates back to the Ottoman times. In the middle here is a main street of Sarajevo, whose buildings were mainly built during the Austro-Hungarian times. And you can even see a tram car going through it. And actually, it's interesting to note that Sarajevo had tram car system even before Vienna did. So it was very developed city already at that time. And on the right here is a school building that was built also, in the 1800s, and that is actually the school where I went to. That was also my high school later. So after the liberation from the Germans, Bosnia, Sarajevo here became a capital city of Bosnia and Herzegovina, one of the 6 equal republics of Yugoslavia, and the only one with no clear population majority. And here you can clearly see all these others: Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, very one-colored. And then you have here Bosnia, especially Sarajevo here, in an area where there is no majority present. So in Bosnia, you had pretty much equal parts of Serbs, a little less Croats, Muslims, and then a lot of these areas where you had a lot of mixed marriages, and people we didn't even know who was who in Bosnia when I was growing up. And I heard someone once say, to divide Bosnia would be to draw borders literally through people's bedrooms. That's how it was. But, after Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia started to crumble, and nationalism was on the rise. And some Yugoslav republics wanted to break away from the country and become their own independent nations. And it was relatively easy if their structures were simple. For example, like Slovenia here, the most Western one, they declared independence from Yugoslavia first, and then they were followed by Croatia. But then in the spring of '92, Bosnians voted for their independence from Yugoslavia as well. But Serbs who lived here, although I must say not all of them, backed by Slobodan Milosevic, who was the main figure in Serbia's politics back at that time, and by the Yugoslav army, wanted Bosnian territories to become part of Greater Serbia. And thus, in the spring of 1992, they besieged the city. And it was relatively, I want to say, easy to do so because of the geographic position of Sarajevo that sits in a valley and is encircled by very high mountains all around it. So this next picture is a picture of pre-war Sarajevo, and a couple things to note here. First, you can see these mountains in the background. That will tell you, that Sarajevo is really in a valley. And then this part here is the old town. And you can see here, probably this is like a 1 square mile area here. You can see a mosque, a Catholic church, Serbian Orthodox church, and then a synagogue is somewhere here. So very close together. And then also note these two high-rise buildings. You will see them also later in the presentation. And this is, of course, the pinnacle of Sarajevo's growth, 1984 and the Winter Olympic Games. I picked this picture because, again, here you can see the position of the city. All the mountains completely encircled by mountains on all sides. So only 8 years after these pictures, we come to herbicide, which is really a term to describe a deliberate attempt to destroy a city, killing of the city. And Sarajevo, unfortunately, my home city, is the prime example of that. This photo here, I think, describes it the best and describes what we call cultural catastrophe in Bosnia, where so many monuments and art institutions, museums were deliberately targeted. This is one of the most beautiful buildings in Sarajevo. It's the City Hall and the National Library. In the summer of 1992, it was deliberately attacked. 1.2 million of books were lost that day, including a complete National Archive, complete collection of University of Sarajevo Library, more than 150,000 of rare books and manuscripts, a lot of which date back to Ottoman times. And I remember my mother, because my parents live very close to this building in the old town. She said that night the sky was illuminated by the fire from the burning books. All of it was lost. Basically, the whole inside, it's just the shell of this building remained. This one on the left here is actually my photo. And I forgot to say this at the beginning of the presentation, that a lot of these photos I pulled off from the internet. They aren't mine, but I know this presentation is not getting published anywhere, so it's okay. So this picture on the left is what I took when I first came to Sarajevo after the war. And I actually came back with my company from here because Parsons won a contract with USAID for infrastructure rehabilitation. So I went there for 2 years with my American colleagues to work in finance department on that project. So this is what I basically found out when I arrived to Sarajevo. This is residential area. And if you just think about this, 90% of all buildings in Sarajevo were destroyed or damaged in some way. On the right also is a residential area. These two here are those two high-rise buildings. That's a downtown business center that were also almost completely destroyed. And this building here and this down here, this is the Parliament of Bosnia building. Can also see heavily damaged. And this on the right is basically what every street looked like if you walked through the city after the siege. And on the left, this is the Olympic complex, actually, This is a stadium where the Olympics were opened and closed. This is a hall that hosted ice skating, I believe, and hockey. And in front of it was a huge soccer field. And that soccer field was turned into cemetery during the siege, filled completely. This here on the left is the building where I had worked before the siege, and on the left, one of the city hospitals. You can basically count windows that aren't destroyed, everything else, and you can only imagine this being a hospital and having to, work or be in that building, especially during winter times. And this is a very personal one. This is my parents' house. A lot of people in Sarajevo had what we called weekend houses outside of the city, and people lived in apartments, in condos during the week. So this house, my mother designed. She was an architect, and it took them, a long time to build it. But on the right is what I found out, what it looked like when I returned. And actually here, I would like to read to you what my mother said about the house and, when they found out the house was destroyed. So here it goes. This morning, I heard the news about our weekend house. Sanja, it's gone completely last night. Who knows? I might have heard the bomb that destroyed it. I just didn't know it. It took a direct hit from the hill on the opposite side, the one you could see from the living room window. The bomb was a massive one. It went straight through the roof into the living room. The bedrooms above the garage are still partially there, or at least that's how I am imagining it. Neighbors who saw it told us there are a lot of wooden beams lying around and that we should somehow collect them. We would probably have enough to heat us through the winter, but it's way too dangerous to go there. We asked them to pile the wood up in the garage for now, if the garage is still usable and dry. So you see, in only 1 second, some idiot destroyed what we had been building for 20 years. I wonder if the person is now happier knowing what he did. I would want him to know that the two of us didn't even blink when we heard the news. Yes, we are sorry we lost it, but compared to all other tragedies here, human as well as moral, this is nothing. So that was very true, what she said, because people in Sarajevo couldn't think of anything material anymore. The main objective was to survive. And believe me, when I say this, and I get very emotional even thinking about it, people who have lived through Sarajevo siege today, they don't even know how they did it. And, for those of us who haven't, we can't even comprehend it. How was it to survive through those 4 years? And here, is some of that survival. Because when you think about it, when you just read the statistics of the siege, that every day for 1,425 days was the length of the siege. And it was the longest armed siege of any city in modern history. 377 bombs was the average number of bombs that fell on the city on any day. And in one day, it was more than 3,000. So you're thinking here of hearing a bomb blast every minute or 2 minutes for a whole day at night. And someone once told me, just imagine hearing it. Just imagine setting your alarm off every 2 minutes for a whole day and night. And now add to it thinking that every minute of that day, you can be killed from that sound. So that's how it was. And when you add to all of this, all the constant bombardment, sniper fire, everything, you add to this that the city was completely cut off from the rest of the world in terms of communication. Telephone lines were shut down at the very beginning of the siege. I did not know if my parents and my brother were alive or dead for 5 months when the siege started. Power, gas, water, all of those were shut off during the major part of the siege, even through 3 very long and harsh winters. There was no railway, airline traffic, everything was halted. Main post office burned to the ground. So we are talking about a complete isolation here. And living your life basically reduced to bare survival. And here, when I saw this picture on the left, I immediately thought of my father, who described his way of carrying water, because there was no running water for most of the time. You had to go to certain places where they organize, like, I don't know what kind of system to fill your containers. And he actually, as I said before, he wrote a lot about life in the siege, and he described how this all went. So here's what he said about buying a little stove in the house and then getting water. Since winter is here and there is no end to power outage, we bought a small handmade stove and installed it in the living room where the TV used to be. The stove is old and it doesn't work well. Of course, we can't heat the whole house with it, but at least we can boil water and make a meal. We still have wood, unlike others who collect branches and little pieces from fallen trees. The situation with water is no different. I have developed a system of carrying as much as possible in one trip. I put 2 smaller containers in a bag over my shoulder and carry 2 more. I get tired just the same, but I balance better. It's not an easy task for your old man, but I have to do it. The worst part is when I cross the bridge, or what is left of it, and that is a single beam 5 inches wide and a metal railing. It's easy on the way there, but on the way back, it's hard to balance. And I don't want to drop my containers because we don't have many anymore. I hold onto the railing with one hand and take the containers across one by one in other. So each trip takes at least 3 crossings, 6 times back and forth on this balance beam. And that is enough water for about 3 days if we ration it. People joke that it will be weird to fall down into the river and be killed carrying water. Many are scared to go across, so they walk to the other bridge, which is much further but more exposed to sniper fire. If I could choose, I would rather fall into the river than be shot by a sniper. I'm fine going across, not dizzy or anything, plus all this physical work has made me stronger. I don't feel 68 at all. I'm too busy to think about it. I have to be positive and hope our fate is to come out of this alive. So here's my mother with that little stove that they bought. This is their apartment in the city, and she's making fire there, I guess. And then on the left, you can see the wood that's piled up. And then this is her little garden on the balcony because, food shortage. Every little place where people could plant some vegetables or something like that, even in buckets, in drawers, anything worked just to have that food on the table. And this is, speaking of food, actually an article that appeared in Los Angeles Times back in '93, where they showed some recipes from the war from Sarajevo women And actually, there was a cookbook that was published. It was a 40-something page brochure that women of Sarajevo collected, basically cooking with just a handful of ingredients, but trying to make these different dishes and just trying to give them different names and such. This here, as you can see, is some sort of cake that's made from stale bread. And you would just add to it a little bit of cocoa powder, which came through the humanitarian aid sometimes. And that would be your cake. Or as rice was one of the main ingredients, I found a recipe for cheese. And cheese was, if you overcook rice, put some yeast, vinegar, and a bit of milk powder, and you let that stand for 24 hours, and it has cheese-like consistency. So that was their cheese. And then this one represents a lifeline that opened up for city residents in the summer of '93. This is the entrance here and the tunnel, and this is the exit of it, the famous Sarajevo tunnel, which is now a museum, and it's called the Tunnel of Hope. And my mother joked that they called it during the war Sarajevo Metro, because that was the only functional transit system in the city. I visited this. These are my pictures, and this is my daughter in the middle there on one of the occasions we visited Sarajevo. But this tunnel was a top secret project that had to be done very professionally, because first of all, it was secret. Then second, it couldn't jeopardize the safety of the airport above. And it was dug right underneath the airport runway. And they started from both sides using just, very manual tools. And the digging started in January. Little by little, in July of 1993, two people who dug from different sides managed to touch their hands somewhere underneath Sarajevo Airport. And that's when this lifeline opened to the free territory. And first, it was used only to take out injured people, to get into the city food. It was all manual. Later, they built a little tram path, and they had these carts, 4 or 5 of them, that they pushed through the tunnel. But because of the sheer volume, later, they had 25 of those, and everything went in and out in those: ammunition, food, medication, injured people, everything. And it was a hard job because the tunnel had a few curves, and also at some point dipped about 5 meters. So you had the underground water coming in there because it was very primitive. And actually it flooded several times all the way to the ceiling. But at the end, it's estimated that when it was in full function, I wrote how much, 20 tons of material was transported through the tunnel each night. And a lot of people think that just, saved the city from starvation and everything else. When I visited the tunnel in 2010, only first 5 or 10 meters were accessible because of the airport above. They had to fill it all up. And today it's a museum. You can go in, the entrance is through this house because it was secret. You enter in here and then you go down, and then this is what the exit was. So you know, as I said before, even under these circumstances, life went on. I spoke earlier, you know, how I believed, you know, a lot of it had to do with how people, of people's perseverance, of people resilience, you know, what circumstances they were under to make something out of that life. You know, here you can see some teenagers probably doing their homework, a couple here kissing while, you know, others search for water. And then these two people who both lost their legs from a bomb, and they met in the hospital, and they fell in love and they got married. You know, and stories like that. All throughout the siege, cultural life in the city never stopped. There was war cinema, there were children's plays, there was more than 250 art exhibitions. Here are some of the art examples. This on the left is a postcard from Sarajevo that I actually received here. Someone carried it out of the city because you couldn't just mail a letter. Someone had to carry it out, and then it had to be mailed from somewhere in Europe. That's how letters went back and forth. And then these are, you know, some posters. These are, for example, posters that commemorated 10 years of the Olympic Games. Here you can see on the right, you know, by that time already in 94, it was well known about the ethnic cleansing, about the concentration camps, rapes, and all, you know, crimes against humanity. Even during the siege, there was a beauty pageant. It was called Miss Occupied Sarajevo. It was held in 92, and it inspired band U2 and Luciano Pavarotti to actually write a song about it, which was called Miss Sarajevo. And then this is another example of that resilience, that mindset. Maybe you will recognize this man here. This is famous world conductor Zubin Mehta, who came to Sarajevo in 1994 because he wanted to hold a concert there with Sarajevo Philharmonic Orchestra of Mozart's Requiem for all the Sarajevan people that were killed. And they held it in the atrium of that National Library and City Hall that I showed you earlier. This is what the building looked like on the inside. It was completely devastated. And they held this concert. They didn't clean up anything. They just put the musicians on some makeshift stage. And this concert was actually broadcast in 76 countries, and I watched it here in the United States as well. Basically, Sarajevans wanted to show the world that they are proud, dignified human beings, that they will not let their soul die. These are the photos that maybe best show that. There are two famous photos from the war. The upper one is called Woman Who Brought Glamour to War Zone. And it was on the cover of major papers at that time. And this lady, who you can see at the bottom, you know, later, she joked how she said she didn't even know that she was a star. And she was on the major covers of all the magazines and everywhere, and she didn't even know it. But this is what she said about this photo. She said, I walked slowly with my head held high. I didn't want to show anyone I was scared. I wore my best clothes in the war. I cut my own hair and warmed up my dried mascara in hot water so I can put it on. This was my answer to those who wanted to kill us, or even worse, to humiliate us. So that's what she said. And, you know, in Sarajevo, there were birthdays, there were wedding celebrations, jokes were told. My brother always joked in his letters, and he said, this I remember the most. He said, Sanja, you know, this war diet has its advantages because everyone has lost all the weight that they have wanted to lose their whole lives and didn't manage to do it until now. And no one has high cholesterol anymore. And my mom, she used to cook with, you know, just a handful of ingredients, and she called all her dishes different names. And my father swore that they all tasted differently. Of course, it's all just rice, you know, and flour and oil and, you know, a little bit of sugar, but, you know, that's what he said. And she knitted and re-knitted blouses, which then, you know, she gave me after the war. My father worked for a local newspaper because he speaks fluent French, and he was translating French articles, which I don't even know how he was getting for a local paper, which was published daily. Schools were operating in the basements. These people who had this concert, they rehearsed in the basement of the opera house, but they did, you know, and I think what pretty much sums up the life in the city and you know how they cope with this is what my dad said. He said, you know, you venture out of the basement to the street and you realistically think your life might be over in the next few minutes, but it's just a thought. The next thing, you start thinking about your next long-term project. You act as though you live forever. And that is the mindset, I think, what carried them through, and you know what helped them go through this and still be, you know, kind of normal, and to show that something to fight for and something worth living is still there, but you know, we just have to find it in us. You can imagine how difficult it was, and you know how isolated these people felt. You know, I was thinking about it a lot during the pandemic because we all felt a little bit, you know, under siege. Everyone was complaining about how isolated we feel, you know, how we don't like this feeling of being stuck in a place. But we have internet. We can go out for a walk. We can go buy groceries. We can, you know, we know what's happening to us. We know the news, you know, we have access to everything. So it's nowhere near, can't even be compared to the isolation that those people felt, that my father said was pretty much like being in an isolation cell in a real prison. You know, so when they got the radio that I had sent to them from here about 2 years into the siege, he couldn't stop talking about it because he said it's one of the vital things for their survival was that radio, so that they have some sort of communication, you know, and they don't sit in darkness and silence for weeks and weeks. So these next few, of course, and I think I'm pretty much running out of time. I timed myself and I said I wouldn't go over 40 minutes and I'm at 50 already, but I have just a few more. So these are just a few photos of before and after. The one journalist who came to Sarajevo after the war decided to live there, and he took all these photos of how buildings were reconstructed. This is that National Library and City Hall. It is really renovated beautifully. This is that building on the outside now. And, you know, we remember This was a memorial put together in 2012 on the occasion of 20 years of the siege. 11,541 chairs, empty chairs, were placed along the main street in Sarajevo, representing each civilian killed during the siege. And these are called Sarajevo roses, obviously bomb craters that after the war, when the streets were repaired, they decided to leave some of these and fill them with red asphalt, and we call them Sarajevo roses. This is the bobsled track, completely devastated, now serves as a tourist attraction, I guess an art outlet here. And then this is the last one. These pictures I took in a museum several years ago. This is a permanent exhibition of objects that people of Sarajevo donated to this museum, of everything and anything they used during the siege to help them survive. These here are all kinds of different little stoves made from different cans, upside down pots. My dad had one made from a pressure cooker, turned upside down, and he said it was fabulous because it could hold heat for a long time. This here is some kind of soap made from cooking the fat, which was waste of some kitchen. And then, these notes here is something that I've never seen anywhere in any museum, that people were so moved what they see in the museum that they felt compelled to leave messages and said, we all need to respect others. Why did this happen? Never again, no war. And here look some people from England and China. And, I saw these all over the place in that museum. So that is all I had for you today. I am sorry I went a little bit over time, but that's the story of Sarajevo. My book, this is the cover of it. It's called The Siege of Sarajevo. And the cover is very special to me because this is the envelope of the first letter that actually came through the post office of Bosnia. This is the first stamp of the Bosnian mail, New Bosnian Mail, and this was from 95. And you can see this, but underneath, kind of in the background of this cover is my mother's handwriting with one of her war recipes there. So that's, again, thank you so much for having me today. I'd be happy to take any of your questions. That's all I had.
Oh, great, Sanja. I will go ahead and I think Gary has some questions that he might want to present to you right now. And sorry, we did start a little late, so you're not really that much over.
Okay.
There you go. Thank you very much, Sonia. That was wonderful. It brought your book alive. I've read portions of it already, and I want to finish it up. My wife has finished it. Has the book, I have a question here, has the book been translated into other languages?
No, I want to translate it myself into Bosnian, which is not going to be difficult because all the letters are in Bosnian originally. So I just have to translate the rest of it. And I actually have a publisher who is interested, to publish it in Bosnia. But for now, it's just in English here. It's published here.
Okay. I think that would be very, very useful and nice for the people.
Yes, yes, yes. I want the younger generation of people to read it, to know what's happened.
I see Norman has his hand
have a
up here.
question
He might
too.
have a question.
Okay.
That the young people know.
Norman, you're on mute there.
Okay, hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I was extremely moved. I had 2 trips to what was then Yugoslavia. I kind of knew what was coming. I think among other, I have lots and lots of things I'd like to share with you. I'm going to get a copy of the book if I can. Here are some thoughts, quickly. First of all, I think the people in Ukraine need and want and could use this book. Very important, very, very important. Okay. Secondly, if you can turn this video that you've done into some vehicle for being shared. Also, just as I was tremendously moved, it's not like I didn't know about Sarajevo, I did, but I was never moved like I was today. Very important. Tiny little things too. Why, and I guess you said you don't really know the answer to this, but why was there no evacuation, massive evacuation? Okay, that's one question. The other was, how much did Russia support Sarajevo? Very important from a propaganda point of view, at the very least, if this is shared with Ukraine. Okay, that's it.
Okay, so your first question was why wasn't there mass evacuation? You know, at the very beginning of the siege, there was some organized evacuation of children and women. My sister-in-law actually was taken out with her two small little boys to Croatia, and then eventually we brought her here to the United States. But then the city was completely under siege, completely. Nothing could come in and out. And the United Nations, they called it UN Protection Force. I don't want to be, not in support of such an organization like the UN, but the UN did not do a whole lot here. They would not facilitate this evacuation. They organized some kind of humanitarian relief, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. So it did not work very well. Later, when the news came of other atrocities all throughout Bosnia, concentration camps and ethnic cleansing and all of that, then people could manage to escape. They were let go to other countries in Europe. Germany took many refugees, so did Sweden and Norway. The United States also. So there wasn't anything organized like I understand is organized for Ukraine, because this all happened very fast. This was unexpected. I don't know, what else to think of it. Russia did not help us. Russia was more allied with the Serbs, who were the aggressors. Although I have to say that many Serbs who lived in Sarajevo did not like this what the Serbs from Serbia and Milosevic were doing. So they suffered with the rest of the Sarajevo population, just as it's mixed that it's always been, but Russia did not play a role here at all. I don't think so. It's
Okay, thank you.
and we also had an arms embargo, unlike Ukraine. Bosnia had arms embargo, and it was from the very beginning very poorly diplomatically and politically handled crisis. And when I saw the headlines these days about Ukraine, I'm just thinking in my head, this can't be that this is exactly the same phrases that they're using. I even have, if you want to see just one more thing, I want to share just a few more slides here where I found, things in the in the paper that I really couldn't believe I was seeing. Let me just share real quick here. I don't know if you can see this, but they're talking about Ukraine atrocities of unimaginable proportions. They're talking about humanitarian catastrophe. You can see those exact same words down here, humanitarian nightmare in Bosnia. And then they're talking about how to impose sanctions on Slobodan Milosevic, just like they're talking now, oh, we are going to impose sanctions, on Russia, and that's going to work. It is not going to work. They're saying here, Maripol says civilians continue to be targeted. As officials warn, the city is on the verge of the humanitarian catastrophe. Go back 30 years, here is children likely to face starvation, humanitarian catastrophe in Sarajevo. Exact same words. Here, President Biden calls for war crimes against Putin. Here is our butcher of the Balkans, Slobodan Milosevic, who was later tried at the International Crimes Tribunal. But that happened 4 years after the conflict started, after 2 million people were displaced and, hundreds of thousands of people who got killed. Here, there's ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, mass killings. Over here, safe havens, which weren't safe havens at all. And, again, comparing to now, they describe actions as a genocide, but who is doing anything about it? No one. And I would hate to think that this conflict drags on like, Bosnian conflict did. Here, another comparison, just the other night, evidence of mass graves. Here, 30 years ago, human remains discovered near Srebrenica, where 8,000 people were killed. Whole genocide. And here is what then the United Nations president said, who was Boutros Ghali. He said that he warns that dispatching peacekeepers on mission impossible could harm organizations' credibility.
I just have one quick comment. It seems to me, I think, but I'm not sure, that NATO should be given, if I'm right, some tremendous support for what NATO was able to accomplish here.
Yes, and NATO warplanes, with and this was done mostly by the United States, that finally the airstrikes were done in 1995, and they lasted for 2 weeks and it was all over. And why couldn't that be done 4 years earlier, And I really liked this part from New York Times, which was from 1992. You can take a minute to read it. But, history repeats itself, even though during the Nazi Holocaust, the world said, this cannot be repeated. And then it's repeated in Bosnia, and now it's been repeated in Ukraine. And I'm really devastated. I'm almost to the point where I cannot even watch the news.
Mm-hmm.
You understand.
There are world
amazing.
leaders, that's what they say in 1992, and you could say the same thing now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, very powerful.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious about how the letters got to you. When did they start coming? Because I would think that they would do something with the mail and intercept it and redact things. Because usually when there's conflicts, they get a hold of the mail and they don't let the word come out to other people. And I was just wondering how you were able to get those letters and how those were able to get through from the country to you.
Yeah, first for 5 months, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
absolutely nothing. And then the first letter that I received was mailed from France. And it was given to a French journalist. And that's mainly how letters were going in and out. You had people who were coming in and out of the city, by, either journalists or diplomats or something like that. So you would try to find someone, and that's how you would normally do it. When I wrote letters back to my family there, I would copy them 3 or 4 times, and then I would try to send them through different channels because I knew not everything would get there. And we had a system of numbering those letters. So, and I know, okay, you've got my letter number 17, and so forth. And then we also established the communication through ham radio operators.
Good.
Which was, a system through Croatia. And if there was a phone, one phone, local phone that was still operating in the city, then you could call them in Croatia and they could establish a connection with that particular neighborhood. And then they could, call people, but it was very, very hit and miss situation, but sometimes it did work. And then later the UN actually helped with the letters. They would collect them. You could come to the post office and you could pay a little bit in cash. There were no stamps or anything. And they would be collecting those letters for about 2 weeks and then taking them out. Or later, some humanitarian agencies, some church groups. I remember that Adventist church was the best. They really delivered packages, they didn't end up on the black market and things like that. So, we were able to send some letters like that. And then my family, we were fortunate that we knew a journalist who was traveling back and forth.
Thank you.
Oh, Sanja, this is great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think our time is up.
Yes.
I'm sorry to say. I think people are interested, and what you're saying and the process, even though it was back in the late 90s, early 90s, it's still true. We haven't learned. We haven't.
Yes, very much so.
And we need to do something. I'm hoping that we will come to a conclusion that will travel forward, and we will actually learn from this latest, because your stories touch me right to the heart, and there's no reason for this destruction.
Exactly.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. All the best to all of you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Good.